Good morning, everyone. This is Gary Kayye, and I have a special guest with me today, Sean Wargo. Many of you may have read stuff that he does all the time, but haven't met Sean. Sean is the Senior Director of Market Intelligence at AVIXA. Sean, how are you?
Great, Gary. How you doing today?
Good. It's great to be talking to you. I've been reporting, I should say, your market intelligence reports for years. Very impressed because back when I was involved with AVIXA, back when it was Infocom and even before then ICIA, this was sort of like a dream of all of us that were involved at that time, was to actually be able to report some data that would be helpful, not just for the members, but even people who are thinking about becoming members or thinking about getting into the industry. And I think you've brought it to a whole new unimaginable level. So first off, I want to say thank you for what you've done for the industry, and also thanks for what you've done during this COVID-19 time and tracking the data. I know that this is not a one-person job.
Sure, absolutely not. I mean, it's something that AVIXA decided to take very seriously in its rebranding efforts several years ago and reimagining itself. Part of what we wanted to do is the strategic initiative at that time, 2016, 2017, is take a hard look at market intelligence. You know, this is an industry that's changing so much, as you've been reporting on in our research. And so we wanted to make sure the data and research that we're collecting reflects that. So it meant being more inclusive. It meant redefining what we think of as the ProAV channel. All those sorts of things went into it, and staying agile as things change through the COVID-19 impact survey stuff that we've been doing. All of that is, as I like to say about this kind of role that I'm in, is essentially being a beacon to the industry. Hey, what's going on? Where are we headed? Where are the glaciers up ahead? The landmines that we need to stay mindful of, for sure.
Well, I want to talk about the research methodology in a minute, but first I want to bring everyone up to date on where we are today, because we are in the middle of this pandemic. We were hoping at this time we'd be at the end of this pandemic, but it's clear that the industry is sort of about in the middle, based on the data, because we've kind of gone over a hump, and we're actually seeing sales declines sort of flatten out. We're seeing people starting to hiring again a little bit. I mean, can you kind of paint a picture of where we are today? You know, obviously it was terrible in March and April, but kind of where are we now, towards the end of August?
For sure. So we have a study we've been running now for 3 years. It's a monthly index that essentially captures what you're talking about, sales and employment data among our AV service providers. And what that's been telling us, exactly as you kind of portrayed, you know, things were dire in March, April. Massive declines in revenue, and therefore employment was cut back to kind of bring costs in line. When you hit a really deep trough, what GDP was minus 33% in Q2, that kind of a trough means it's easier to return to growth, even if you're not truly growing, right? And that's the story we're in now, is we're recovering from a very low point in revenues as we adapt as an industry, as we find new sources, as we shift our services and such. But gosh, we're not going to be growing as an industry, truthfully, over the peaks of 2019 for into next year, and in some categories beyond that. So I think it's a good story. It's a story of tentative, slow steps towards recovery, not a V-shaped that some people were hoping for as for the economy. The stock market certainly looks more V-shaped. But in terms of our industry, service providers, it's going to be much more what we're calling a Nike swoosh, where it was a good pop in the beginning, but sort of levels off and stabilizes to a more gradual growth as we go out through the rest of this year and then into next. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you look back to April, having the word stabilize in any sentence when you're talking about the economy with regard to AV is actually a good thing. And I do see, and you have even reported on, there are some really good positive things, because even though, you know, certainly everyone had to reset their business, right? There's been layoffs, there's been reorganization, and then there's been sort of like a pivot in the way that people look at, I should say, manufacturers and integrators are looking at what they provide customers, right? And that's starting to be reflected in your reports a little bit.
That's for sure. So We had seen, so one of the things we've been talking about, I think you mentioned in some of your articles as well, is a lot of what we're seeing is actually a reinforcement or an amplification of trends that had existed, right? I mean, we were all talking about conferencing and collaboration, content distribution, all the sorts of online, more even IT sounding types of solution sets. So now that we're in lockdown mode and couldn't be in person, our industry has had to shift even more strongly in that direction to supporting virtualization of events and remote work and remote learning and all those sorts of things. So yeah, that is the positive. It's a forced adaptation for some, a painful adaptation for many probably too. But you are seeing in our week-to-week surveys before we stopped them in June, we were seeing a rising percentage of companies saying, hey, I'm at full capacity now, because a lot of that work I've bridged over to it. It's filling my project calendar. In some cases, they're even helping retool classrooms that are empty to prepare for synchronous learning, all those kinds of things, and supporting live events that have gone virtual. So that is the positive. I would put air quotes around the positive, so to speak, because yeah, it's still painful for many firms, and we have to kind of call out the fact that while it's 33% that are at full capacity, there's a few percent that are saying I'm closed. You know, I've shut the doors temporarily, maybe permanently, and that's
What
kind
is
of the
that
hard reality.
percentage? Do you know what that number is yet?
So the permanent was about 2. The remainder, so there was maybe a 10 to 15% that were kind of saying a temporary. Now, the bulk is people that are kind of saying, hey, I'm at reduced capacity of some sort, and so it's kind of blurry. You know, it's unless they're telling me you're full on or full closed, everything in the middle is kind of this gray area, where people are like just getting by.
But 2% closing is actually pretty good when you compare to, like, for example, the restaurant industry. You know, I walk up and down our local streets here, even in Chapel Hill, and we're kind of an insulated community because we're a college town, so we almost have a guaranteed economy. And you still see businesses closing down, and it's definitely not 2%. I'd say in a lot of places for retail and restaurants, and I don't know the actual data, maybe you know, but it's got to be in the range of 10, 15, 20% in some cases.
Yeah, and you know, the reality, Gary, is that may be true of our space too. I think sometimes when you ask, especially in this kind of fast-moving environment, a firm will say, they're not going to say they're permanently closed because they maintain some optimism. It's like, even if their plan is to re-emerge as something different down the road that can be temporary in nature, and you're seeing that a lot. Businesses, you know, my wife's in yoga. She's a yoga teacher, and actually yoga studios are saying the same thing. They're getting rid of their physical space for now, but plan to come back in person. And I think even in our space, AV professionals are probably the same. You know, they're kind of pulling back to a bare minimum, taking what projects they can, calling that a temporary closure, not a permanent I'm done, unless they were hoping to perhaps close the doors anyway for succession planning. So I think I would hedge it a little bit by saying, you know, there's probably still more casualty yet to come of firms that kind of just decide this is it, you know, and the principals go on to do something else. And it may look very different in the end.
So your report last month, I sort of challenged it a little bit in my article and said that, hey, I think things might be a little bit better than what you're reporting, simply because I see areas that of services specifically in and around both UCC virtual that may or may not be included in your reporting. And another area I think is the other segments of the industry that are sort of outside the purview of the most AV people that are still AV like services. For example, companies that do their own thing, right? The companies that actually buy and install products themselves outside of the AV industry. Maybe they come around the AV industry by going to CDW or other retailers like that, right? And then we have the market of new opportunities that are come into the AV industry that didn't exist before. And I'll give you a specific example. You know, the thermo measurement, products, right? Where you're measuring somebody's temperature. It's not something an AV integrator was even in the market for selling. And if somebody did, then it would be highly unusual, right? So tell me where the if I look at the circle of everything you're reporting, where are the fringes that you're starting to bring into that circle, and where am I right, where am I wrong?
Yeah, for sure. I think those fringes are really important to call out because it's those areas in these times of fast adaptation that are the hardest to gauge.
Yeah.
How fast is that going to grow? How fast is it going to replace revenues that we've seen? But kind of talking about the way we frame the industry, this is something we decided to do back in 2017 is redraw the circle around what we were calling ProAV. And we
Yeah.
started to include technologies that traditional integrators who were very focused on installed audiovisual technologies that we're all familiar with, whether it's speakers, mics, displays, the usual suspects, with potentially some service elements wrapped in it, of course, right? So installation, integration. What we decided is, look, a significant amount of back-end infrastructure is now involved in a solution set. That's particularly in areas like conference and collaboration, even if you're building a huddle room or facilitating or supporting a large auditorium with some sort of connected infrastructure. That sounds very IT, right? So we started to draw the circle saying there's media servers, storage products, networking products that are becoming a part of what we would call tentatively AV, just because they're part of a solution set that at its core, at its kind of definition, it's AV oriented. It's designed to help facilitate the transfer of audio and visual signal and content. So we started to include it. And that was controversial for some companies who looked at our numbers and said, why are you including general media servers? We said, because so many of our integrator installers are having to at least support them, if not install and sell them themselves.
Yeah, the input devices that are going to them came from the AV industry, yeah.
Exactly. Digital signage, perfect example of that. Right?
Actually, that's a great example, yeah.
You have to be able to handle content distribution to truly support a digital signage installation, especially multi-mode or multi-node kinds of installation. So we started to include that. Each year we continue to refine in that service category, especially, and in this IT sounding, what we call streaming media storage and distribution category. We continue to pull more in because we realized, as you just defined, you're absolutely right. The types of providers are changing. It's not just traditional AV integrators who involve now. It's IT sounding integrators. It's design firms that are looking to build out customer experiences. Live event providers.
I've noticed even contractors, high voltage contractors, and even building contractors are starting to include AV in their services of packaged products. And whether or not they do the install themselves or they bring in an AV company to hang and bang it is what I'm wondering is how much of that are you able to ferret out and track versus what's really going on out there.
Yeah, you use as much as you can. I mean, our total methodology is a modeling methodology. So we start with some basic numbers from manufacturers shipping in. We look at integrators, we look at end user purchase, all that to try to model it out. What you end up doing is deciding how much do we claim, do we say is part of our definition, and you make assumptions about that. Obviously, in some cases like security installations, we claim a very small percent because there's so much more that's beyond our purview. So we start including that. We start pulling in cloud-based services. We revise that number every single year as more and more becomes cloud-based, software-based, all that sort of stuff. So what I especially liked about your article is while I do feel we're including some of that stuff, I think there's opportunity around the margin that is potential upside beyond what we're forecasting. So as you noted in your article, we were saying a minus 10%, 9 to 10% globally on revenues. Some markets worse, some better, some categories worse, some better. And then next year returning to growth, single digits, et cetera. What gets us to better growth than we're even forecasting and potentially mitigate some of the near and negative declines, better even than what we think. We feel like we've pulled some of that in to kind of offset the huge declines we're seeing this year, is those margin areas. So what I can't say is that we're fully including all that margin stuff right now, because I think, as we just talked about, with firms themselves kind of adapting to this changing normal. I don't know what a new normal is in a changing environment, changing normal. They're going to have to look for new opportunities, new product sets that they weren't
Right.
really thinking
Right.
they were going to sell before.
Right.
And so do we capture all of that? Probably
And
not. Yeah.
yeah, and that was my point is, and
Hmm.
I was trying to point out where the dealer can find those opportunities in my article, and even listing the different categories. And I'd like to throw out a couple of examples, and you tell me whether or not this is tracked. There's a you've probably seen it if you watch any nonlinear television. There's a Microsoft Teams ad out right now where the head of a hospital, and I forget which hospital it is, maybe St. John's or St. Jude's hospitals out there saying, now on Teams we're doing 5,000 e-appointments or electronic or virtual appointments a day. And before the COVID-19, we were doing 0. So literally they adopted Teams, the commercial saying we adopted Teams. Number one, it's HIPAA compliant, right? That's what they're kind of inferring there. But number two, that all of a sudden they went from you could only see a doctor by coming in person to, by the way, 5,000 of our appointments, maybe it's a day or a week. It's some very small period of time. I was surprised by the number. But they run the commercial constantly, and it's basically a commercial for Teams. So that first install, that first example, I guarantee it was done directly by Microsoft, right? I mean, they obviously had to go in there and say, well, let's proof of concept. Yet all the other ones, Microsoft, yeah, they might do some of these giant hospital things, and maybe they'll partner with Epic, somebody like Epic, and say, let's bring it through that way. But in reality, shouldn't all of that telemedicine be part of AV, for example, and a place that, for example, as an integrator, you should pivot to, because it's providing video services both directions, just like a video conferencing company does. And are you tracking that?
Yeah, it's a great example. And I think the answer is partially, because we do have a category we call, or a solution area, conferencing collaboration, within which that would fall. And there are software and cloud-based aspects of that in our forecast. And we've actually shown conferencing collaboration is one of the more stable parts of the industry in the face of all these declines. Yeah, because obviously we're doing it right now. We kind of have to do this. But I think the question mark becomes how much of that ends up in the AV provider's plate,
right,
versus a non-traditional or a direct. We try to account for the fact that not all the revenues we represent in our forecasts are necessarily flowing through an integrator. They may be direct spends in some cases, because some firms have embedded integration. They have providers that kind of are in-house. That's particularly true in higher ed and corporate. So we account for some of that. Now, the rate that these things are growing, though, it's happening in such real time, and the revenues are kind of falling out. I mean, it's no surprise that Teams, Microsoft is leading one of the top 5 in the NASDAQ right now. There's tremendous consolidation up at the top of the NASDAQ in technology companies, particularly software. So it would therefore fall, and make sense that some of that's going to translate into our industry. Now, is our industry completely positioned to support a more software and cloud-based offering? Not entirely, right? And that's why I think we're seeing this.
But that was my point in the article, is we need to move that direction, because otherwise, like what happened 15 years ago, we lost video conferencing for a while because it went to the telecoms, because we didn't move quickly enough on that, is my opinion. And if you look at that 5,000 appointments, that means there's a whole bunch of microphones, a whole bunch of headphones, a whole bunch of video cameras, and other things that ancillary products that go along with it. So I think that's the part of it that you might be tracking, depending on how it gets through the distribution. Likewise, the other example I was going to give you is at my university, University of North Carolina. Like in the School of Media and Journalism, I had some level of input and control over that, and I could say these are the brands you need to use, and they went out and bought all new mic arrays and speakers and cameras based on what I spec'd. But the rest of the university went out and put cameras in all the big lecture halls, and they're all security cameras rather than being conferencing cameras. But they're being used for conferencing, but that was what the IT people knew, rather than they didn't know the conferencing side. So that's an example of where I feel like that could have been done by an AV professional had they brought this in their purview, or maybe even some of it was, but the hardware that was spec'd was more IT based rather than AV based, but it still serves the same purpose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are examples of, yes, on the hardware side, we capture some of that pretty well. It's still an allocation methodology though, so there's some of that. Now we're going to So your example, maybe we didn't get that one as much, but we got another one that we included, include more of. So it's kind of this balancing act of, what's in the mix. I think all of these are great examples of kind of upside potential. We've built some of that into the modeling, and some will look at our forecasts honestly and say, gosh, you guys are really, you're really bullish. Like, I think live events would be a good example. We are minus 20+% points down, but that's an industry that's at a standstill, pivoting as much as it can to virtualization. But we think that they're adapting to some of what you're talking about. Where I think, as I look at our forecast and where I think your examples kind of play in, I feel that right now we may have been conservative about the decline, but we're also being very conservative about the lift that can come in future years from these innovative technologies. I think we're probably overly bearish there. I would say, it may still mean that true return to growth is not until 2021. But I think the outer years of this forecast, gosh, could be way higher because of all this adaptation. The companies, we haven't, and honestly, as you and I both know, Gary, looking at the product market, there's probably stuff coming we haven't even seen yet.
Yeah,
innovations.
Exactly. There is stuff coming that that neither one of us know, but there's even stuff that some of us do know that is coming. Especially, you mentioned digital signage. The way that it's going to sort of sideswipe our industry is very similar to the way I see digital signage having sideswiped the digital cinema industry, right? Where a lot of signage is used in digital cinema, yet it's done through the cinema providers rather than the signage providers like National Cinema Network and people like that. And so it wouldn't show up sort of as an AV thing because they're already in the theater and they already own the exhibition houses, right? I mean, so they're doing it for themselves.
Yeah, and that's what we're hoping to. I think the combined efforts, yours, ours, is essentially exactly this. It's trying to illuminate these potential opportunities.
Yeah, exactly.
Be somewhat conservative about how the rate at which, because we don't want to be overly bullish either. But say, look, this is coming. Catastrophe and the types of things we are the mother of invention. That's when we see innovation kind of ramp really fast and in ways we could not have foreseen in the future or in the past, sorry. So I think that's what we have to keep talking about is how does this change our landscape? How do providers have to adapt to it? You and I had already both heard, people come to Infocom and other shows. What were they there to learn about? A lot of it was AV over IP. I mean, that was
future
a constant
trends.
thing.
Yeah. Where are we going to go in the future? Yeah.
All these are kind of examples of those things playing out, and it's going to surprise us. I think it's going to wow us. I think our industry is in a very interesting position. I know you and I have had conversations about where the market is, and I think all this innovation points strongly to commercial kinds of professional installation, where if we're nimble as an industry and as providers, we can get in front of some of that. It's going to strain our capacity and our capability. But that's how you kind of persist and thrive. So,
well, I would encourage people, if you're not reading the reports, a lot of this stuff has been made free. A lot of the summary reports are made free through AVIXA. If you're a member of AVIXA, you get all the data and it's easy to get. AVIXA.org. If Sean's easily accessible, Sean Wargo, WARGO. I'll link his LinkedIn profile in this. I encourage you to connect with Sean, the Senior Director of Market Intelligence at AVIXA. Thanks for what you've done for the industry. And thanks for doing this today. And I appreciate the support you've given the industry and the knowledge base that you're giving the industry in the future.
My pleasure. Let's keep talking.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. You can watch all of our podcasts and videocasts at rAVepubs.com.